Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode in the Data Visualization Society's Biz Career Series. I'm Elijah Meeks. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at a startup called Notable, where we're making computational notebooks. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Data Visualization Society and a data visualization practitioner. And today I have as my guest, Alan Wilson. He's a principal designer at Adobe and involved in some of this Data Visualization Society stuff too, which we'll talk about a bit. Alan, welcome. How you doing? You're muted, Alan.
I'm doing great.
You have to have
the
full 2022 feel.
Yes.
So, Alan, talk to me a bit about what it means to be a principal designer at Adobe. What's that day-to-day work look like?
Well, I mean, I feel like every principal designer at Adobe will give you a different answer. For me,
Yep.
I work on Adobe's enterprise business. So some of the products that people may be less familiar with, things like Adobe Analytics or Experience Manager. And I kind of helped the design team just make our products better, right? So I work a lot on the interfaces and specifically anything having to do with data visualization. And my day to day is meetings and design work. Yeah.
So, there are folks who I've had designers on, and I've had an engineer on so far, and you're probably a bit higher up in the sort of leadership, the hierarchy. Talk to me a bit for folks who don't know what the levels of designers are, what the difference is between, say, a principal designer and whatever would be underneath that.
Yeah, well, it varies org to org, but at Adobe, we have, associate designers, senior designers, staff designers, and then principal designers. And as you kind of climb up that chain, you're just becoming a more equipped, a more robust designer. You're able to handle more things. You're a better collaborator, better stakeholder, and at my level, you have a lot more autonomy in the kind of problems you work on, the kind of things you do, which I think is great. And yeah, I don't know. I'm trying how best to articulate it. There's
Well,
so
no,
much
I think
that
that,
goes on.
when we talk about sort of leveling for engineering positions, which I'm a little bit more familiar with,
Mhm.
there is that emphasis that you're not just a better and better sort of technician, right? Like a principal designer you can't just, oh, I could whip up this UI wireframe in 10 minutes, whereas an entry-level designer would take 10 days. It's more about
Right.
leadership and communication, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, there's an aspect of just getting better at your job, but there's also an aspect of the complexity of problem that you can solve. And your bag of tricks is a little bigger, and so you have a larger well of experience to draw on. But yeah, I mean, it's true. A lot of the job is communicating and collaborating with other people, and product design especially. You're always working with product managers, engineers, researchers to find ways to make the product better, and that's
Right.
never, a solo effort.
Right. And for most folks, I would imagine, even myself earlier on, if I had said, hey, there's going to be an interview with somebody who's a principal designer at Adobe, then they would start to think about the sort of traditional Adobe products, right? Adobe Photoshop, maybe, Illustrator, of course. But Adobe does deal with database, right? This is what you've been working on for, we've known each other for years. They've been working on different uh, either data visualization tools or authoring products, right?
Yeah, yeah. If you think about even the very first version of Photoshop, like back in like the early 90s, version one of Photoshop had histograms that showed you the levels of your
Oh,
photos
right,
so that
right.
you could adjust them. right? Data viz has been in Adobe's DNA since day one. Uh, it sometimes gets pushed off to the side, and sometimes we don't use it as well as we could. But you'll find data visualization littered throughout. And depending on how you want to define data visualization, even something like a color picker could be perceived as a visualization of a color model. And it's certainly a step up from filling out, filling out an RGB value to having a visual representation of color that you can use to choose a color. So yeah, data viz is all over.
Well, I think it's the case in data visualization just like it is in other areas of design. That once you've gotten good enough at it, it disappears, right? Because I didn't think about this at all. You're absolutely right. When I go and want to adjust levels, or I want to go and adjust whatever, there's histograms of the different um, color regions that are in, or anything, and also, yeah, color pickers. And I'm sure once I take on that perspective, there's traditional. I mean, we don't even have to get uh, uh, ambitious about it, right? There's traditional data visualization all over a product like Photoshop. And so,
Yeah.
is that maybe is much thought given to that, or has that become so established and standard that it's more about just implementation and making the implementation sort of smoother and smoother? Or do people think about, hey, I wonder how we could present the and I know that Adobe's a big organization, maybe you're not privy to these conversations, but how can we present the data layer more to help artists to better understand what they're trying to achieve?
No, it's absolutely part of the conversation. I'm not part of every meeting everywhere, of course, but
Yeah.
uh, we discuss it a lot. We are always trying to find ways to improve the experience. I mean, one way to think about it is tightening feedback loops, right?
Right,
So,
right.
especially creative software, when you're working with that software, you're putting your ideas onto a screen, and seeing them on the screen, gives you input you wouldn't have otherwise. And having the different UI controls gives you input and control over those things. And interacting with that, creates this feedback loop between you and the machine. And data viz can be a really effective way to augment that feedback loop in ways that nothing else can. Sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes just the number is enough. Sometimes, all you need is a simple slider or something of that effect. But other times you need something really complex. And we're not shy about embracing that when it improves the experience and makes it empowers the creative professional.
I mean, it's really exciting. It's one of those, I wish we had, just like we have folks who are deeply interested in historical data visualization, and they're going through all of these magazines and old books and things like that to find amazing examples of data visualization from 1913 or whatever. It would be a really interesting survey to look at where data visualization shows up in tools that you don't really think of as being data visualization. Because I mean, for me, for someone who's been deeply involved in database for years and years, yeah, it just came out of left field when you pointed that out. When you said, hey, that histogram you're looking at over here and that you've looked at every time you've used this application, that's data visualization. It seems so obvious, but I didn't even consider it, right? But at the same time, Adobe's making more purpose-built tools for what we think of as more traditional analytics or explanatory data graphics, right?
Yes, yes, and that's where I spend most of my time, right, is on those enterprise products. And so this is for typically large organizations that are looking to better understand their user base. And so there's things they're doing to, personalize the web experience, or to enable their mobile apps to be more responsive to a user's needs. And so it just, as you can imagine, involves a mountain of data.
Oh
And
yeah.
we're always looking for ways to better parse that data and present that data so that it's useful for end users.
And what aspect of it? I mean, are you just as a principal designer? Does that mean you sort of zoom into various areas? Is there something particular that you have focused on over lately in your career?
So, one of the biggest areas of focus in the last 3 years is design patterns. Now, previous to that, I'd done a lot of work on design systems. Adobe has a design system called Spectrum. It's actually open. You can look at it. It's public facing, spectrum.adobe.com. Um, and that design system didn't have any guidelines for data visualization for several years. And so that was one thing I worked on, is to add data visualizations to the design system. But then I have added additional guidelines and layers, and these unfortunately aren't public facing, but for how we do enterprise software of different patterns. So you can think of what are the most common things you might find in a user interface, and creating rules and guidelines around how to do those things so that the experience is consistent across products. It also helps us because as a design team, we have a large design organization. We can solve the easy common problems quickly and easily, and focus our efforts on the more valuable and novel parts of the experience. So that's
And
the initiative that I lead up and spend the majority of my time doing.
tell me, what do you mean practically uh, by that? Like, what do you mean practically by the more
Well,
novel,
yeah,
focusing on the more novel?
let me talk about a design pattern, something that isn't novel at all. Um,
Sure.
because our software is almost entirely web-based, you don't have the luxury of some of the things that an operating system affords, right? Like if you're in Photoshop and you want to open a photo, you're not actually using the Photoshop interface as much as you are the operating system,
Right,
right?
right.
Your Mac OS Finder or Windows, and that's how you find your file and you open it up and then you get dropped into the application. Well, in the web, you don't have an operating system beyond the browser. There's certainly no local storage, right? So
Hmm.
we have a pattern for inventory, is what we call it. It's the equivalent of Mac OS Finder. And before we had this pattern, we were we had a dozen different flavors of inventory, and each one had its own nuance and differences. And now we're coalescing around a common pattern here, so that's not unique, and it shouldn't be, right? It's really kind of
Right, it's
uh,
commodity level.
just
You're not going to innovate around
exactly.
file management. Yeah.
And
Let
so
me
the more
talk
novel
about a bit.
experiences is
Yeah.
where you might do an A/B test, right? Like, how do you author an A/B test for an email you want to send out, or how do you author a new audience, right? I want to send out this email to a group of people. How do I define that group of people? What does the rule builder look like when I create that? So that's where we prefer to focus our time and energies, on those more novel experiences.
Right. And so by building these systems, you end up reducing the friction of your stakeholders being probably other designers who don't want to think about the commodity level stuff, and they want to focus on where you can provide uh, new value to downstream customers,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
And so this is Spectrum. This is
Yep, that's Spectrum. If you go
was there
to the left under Foundation, there's a few data viz things under there, and then in the component sections, you'll find specific data viz components, line
so
chart,
what's a
bar
what's a
chart, and so
good
on.
there we go, data visualization.
Yeah, so we have
So
a brief
who were
section on
you
kind of fundamentals, and yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering, who was this being developed for, and what were you thinking when you were developing the aspects of the system, the data visualization aspects of this?
Well, it's kind of an evolution of a style guide, right?
Right.
So back in my early career, when I was doing agency work and doing a lot of branding work, you design a logo for a client and you say, all right, here's your logo and here's all the guidelines on how you use that logo and the typography that goes with it, maybe the photography style, and so on. Uh, a design system is a more formal version of that,
Hmm.
aimed at the people building software. And because our software has data visualization, we wanted to create guidelines for the visualizations that go into our software. So it's for designers, it's for engineers, it's for the people building software, but also, I mean, Adobe has a huge range of external developers. And that's one of the reasons we made this public facing, is to make it easier
Right.
for people developing plugins and so on to, understand the system they're interfacing with and maybe have some guidance on how to style things.
That's great. No, and it's extremely useful, and we've had conversations in within the data visualization side, especially Amy Cecil, who's another co-founder, about sort of data visualization style guides, and, how to effectively create those, when to create them, when to borrow them from, or utilize these open source guidelines from folks like Adobe. So what I want to do now,
Yep.
Alan, is I want to talk about something we've talked about with all of our guests, which is how you got here, right? And we always ask everybody who comes on the show to visualize their journey, because we're data visualization people. And this was the approach that you took. Walk me through. Talk to me about the approach, and walk me through what it's saying here.
Well, I'm a bit odd as a designer because I love numbers. I love spreadsheets. And so I took a very analytical approach to this. I looked at how I spent my time since I was born up until today,
Mm-hmm.
and created this visualization. So I'm using Tableau to do this, and Google Sheets. Those are only two tools I use. And what you're seeing here is just kind of a 100% area chart. The height represents a 24-hour day and where I spent that day. So as a baby, I slept a lot. My parents, I'm the oldest of six children, and so my parents often talk about just how great a baby I was because I just would sleep all the time. And that was I've been known to sleep in class and school, a lot of things. That's a trend I feel like I've continued. So you can see sleep represents a large
Right.
swath of the time I have spent on this planet. And then I divided the rest of my time between kind of things that are productive and then just who I spend my time with, whether it's friends,
Yeah.
family, or just by myself doing hobbies and things. I further subdivided this, and this is where I think we'll spend a little more time. So I still have family and friends and time, alone doing hobbies and things. And then my more productive time is, work in my later career, a lot of school, early career, and then church and volunteer service. And there's this giant
Mm-hmm.
purple bar in the middle where I served as a missionary, white shirt, black name tag.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're probably familiar with us. Uh, and, that was a big kind of middle of my life event.
And you didn't
Yeah,
you didn't mess around with that, right? Like you took the Olympic level challenge because you were a missionary in Los Angeles.
I was in Los Angeles for 2 years, and spent some of that time in really rich neighborhoods like Bel Air and Beverly Hills, and also spent 5 months in South Central and another 3 months in Watts. So it was a really eye-opening experience as a kid from Colorado
Yeah.
uh, in the suburbs to see what the rest of the world, or at least one part of the world, looks like. Uh, Really formative experience for me.
So looking at a chart like this, what jumps out at you are these regular spikes of red and purple, which is family and school. Is that right? Or family and school and maybe work
That's
too.
right. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the blue here is the purple. The blue and purple is really close in color. I could
Yep.
probably make some improvements to this
Well,
chart. But yeah, so here
there's
you
a
can
couple
just
of
see.
purples between church and work. Yeah.
Right, right. Yep. And it's difficult to do these charts. There's so many things I'd like to
Yeah.
change, but just doesn't quite work. Anyway, no, this sawtooth pattern you're kind of seeing is representative of school years and summers, right? The way I spent my time, during the school year was significantly different than how I spent it during the
Right.
summers. Summer I spent a lot more time with friends and family, um, uh, and during the school year you go to school. um, I always did some sort of, academic work in the summer,
Mm-hmm.
largely thanks to my mother, who made sure I
Mm-hmm.
kept up on my reading and so on. So there's always some academic going on in the summer. Um, yeah, so that's you'll see that pattern throughout, and even in college, right? I
Yeah.
had a pretty traditional college education, 4 years, got a BFA in graphic design, and with the exception of my senior year, went home for the summer.
Right, right. I mean, it's a really interesting thing. We're sort of constrained by the tools and the representations of data that we have. Because when I look at a visualization like this, I'm reminded of some work we did back at Stanford, a project we called Topo Time, which was topological time. And the core inspiration for it was that you could have an expression. You could say in English something that was very challenging to show visually, which is the summers of my youth, right? The summers of my youth are a very real temporal phenomenon, but you're not referring to this sort of uh, chronological sequential time. You're really talking about like an entire blob of time that resembles itself.
Right, right. And I mean, one other variation I made of this was an attempt to better show that, right? So by
Right.
separating out the different slices, you can kind of connect the school years and see, the trend across school years and then the trend
Hmm.
across summers. I mean, one notable thing you see right away is this like giant drop in friends in the middle of second grade, and you might think like, "Oh no, what happened, Alan? What happened to
Right.
all your friends?" Well,
What
I
did you
mean,
do?
so I have. Well, I moved, right? My family moved in second grade from where I had been living in Aurora, Colorado to Broomfield, Colorado. And so,
Right.
as you can imagine, in second grade, when you move, you lose all your friends. You got to
That's what
start
happened.
over. So this was another visualization to better tell stories like that.
So we often hear this the refrain from the old, and it's really old now. That classic movie, The Matrix, right? Where there's the scene in The Matrix where one of the guys says, "Oh, I don't. You don't look at the Matrix like human beings. You look at it as the little falling green characters, because I can read it, right?" And I always think about this when people are narrating the data visualizations they create. So for you, that dip was a vignette. This was a moment of semantic meaning. This was a story that was being told in the data. And I wonder, was that always there with you? Was it you said that like you loved spreadsheets and numbers? Was there always this sense that you saw patterns, and for you they had this kind of storytelling aspect to it, or is that something you cultivated later?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, my father's an accountant, and so like growing up, allowance was given on like a P&L style statement, right? Like here's your allowance, here's your
Take notes,
expenses.
parents.
here- Uh, and so early on, I was familiar with the numbers and spreadsheets, and had fairly early exposure to computers. But my biggest foray into this is like video games and board games. I've always been a bit of a gamer, and I found that spreadsheets were some of the best way to play around in that space and make my own games and make modifications to games and
Yeah,
things. And
yeah.
so I spent a lot of time doing that. I guess another aspect is graphing calculators, in high school.
Hmm.
Like, again, math was fun to me. I enjoyed math, but
Yeah,
math was really cool when I got my TI-83 and I could see math, right? I could type in a simple equation and I could see a parabola or a shape of an equation. And I thought that was super cool. And
yeah.
but I was also very interested in art. I spent a lot of time drawing and doodling and taking art classes. And so when I was finished with my mission, I went to college. There's a whole story about getting into the design program. Not my first try, I'll just put it that way. But once I did get in, I just sort of abandoned all that. I left that all behind and said, I'm a designer now, I'm going to design.
Okay.
And so for a long part of my career, I just didn't do anything with that mathematical, analytical side of my personality outside of my hobbies, right? Um, and so it was later in my career when I joined Adobe. And when I first joined Adobe, I wasn't allowed to work on the icons or the charts. Like the rest of the UI is fair game, but just don't bother with the icons or charts. And at a certain point, I reached a point where I could touch the icons and the charts. So that was the first thing
Mhm.
I did. I fixed all those icons that were problematic, and the chart visuals. And as I did that, I knew I needed to ramp up. And so I started buying books and reading blogs and doing everything I could to learn about data visualization. And that journey really began about 12 years ago. And since that
Oh
time,
wow.
um, I I still, if I feel uncomfortable saying it, but I'm going to say it. I've become a data visualization expert, right? With no formal training, just by being interested in it and doing my best to educate myself and then practice the things that I've learned.
Well, I mean, it matches up. 12 years ago is roughly when I started to get into professionally into data visualization. And, in this same kind of, we've heard a similar story, Lisa Mahapatra, who was talking about being a data journalist and realizing, well, heck, I know how to do this other skill that allows me to succeed in ways that the people around me, because they didn't have a math background or an aptitude for it or an interest in it, didn't. But it is interesting that I think, the last 10 or 15 years has seen the growth of a number of these sort of self self-made is a problematic statement, but self-educated data visualization experts. And I think we're kind of or it feels to me like right now we're dealing with that. We're dealing with criticism and pushback about lessons and rules and how to do data visualization. You're hearing a lot of people, at least on Twitter, where the data visualization conversations often happen, um, trying to say, hey, are these actually real, or is this just something somebody made up when they were playing around with data visualization 10 years ago? What do you think about that? What do you think about that conversation? What do you think about sort of rules and guidelines and things like that?
Yeah, well, so coming from a design world, this is the type of conversation like we've been having for centuries, right? Like a lot of people try and impose rules on design, what is and isn't good typeface. I mean, when the first sans serif typefaces came out, they were dubbed grotesque. And to this day, they're referred to
They
as,
embraced it,
grotesque
yeah.
typeface. Um, they they were viewed as bad, right? And now we would never think that. And so standards evolve and change. And you have other designers that approach design with like no holds barred, like anything goes, let's get crazy. And there are designers that do that very successfully and some that don't. But I approach things from a more balanced perspective, right? I think guidelines are really useful, especially for people that are new and lost, and they need
Hmm.
some sort of mooring, some sort of reference, some rubric to to know what they should and shouldn't do. But as you grow in the field, as you grow as a designer in data viz, in anything really, um, you start to understand where the subjectivity is, where
Hmm.
rules are helping you, where they're hindering you, and when it's okay to break them. I mean, was it Picasso that said first
Right.
you have to know the rules before you can break them? And I think that holds true for the most part.
It's an interesting, before, as we were getting set up for this interview, we were talking a bit about Tufte and sort of the problematic relationship folks have with Tufte. Tufte is a great popularizer of data visualization, of modern data visualization, what we think of as sort of this, the quantitative display of information. And at the same time, um, based perhaps on the guidance that he's given, based perhaps on maybe some personality conflicts. Um, there's extreme amounts I always think about who's watching this. And I know that some of the people who are watching this are like the people who I know on Twitter, and they know all of this. And then there's other folks who don't know about this and who think, oh, yes, I read data visualization. I love Tufte. And they don't realize that within the data visualization community, there's this problematic relationship with Tufte that I think fits very much within what you're describing as learning about and having good guidance when you're early on in your career. And then that moment when you have to sort of learn how to discard it. And I wonder, did you go through this? Have you seen anything that 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 you can provide sort of gentle support, advice to people who maybe haven't gone through this, and they think, oh my God, is this what I have to do to become a senior designer or a senior data visualization developer?
Well, I guess the biggest piece of advice I would give is don't lose sight of what data visualization is for. Um, and data visualization can serve a wide range of needs, from entertainment to whatever. I Most of the visualizations that I've done in my career focus on data visualization as a tool for solving problems. Usually, that problem is a communication problem, or an understanding problem, or something of that nature. And so, when you're reading a book like Tufty, think through that lens. Think through the lens of,
Hmm.
is this rule or guideline that's being presented useful in the setting in which I need it? If it is, then take advantage of it. And if it's not, then don't feel too bad about just ignoring it. Um, I think that's okay. I mean, one small example from Tufty is a lot of his early books, at least, focus on the nuances and intricacies of effective print design, and specifically print design for newspapers.
Right. That's a good
And
point.
if that's what you're doing, that's super useful information to understand how the printers work, and how ink isn't always going to be perfectly aligned, and the different techniques you can use to counteract those problems you're likely to encounter in that very specific domain.
Hmm.
But if you're doing all your design in D3, that's not relevant.
Yeah,
And it's
we don't have to
okay
worry.
to kind of ignore it.
I mean, it's an interesting point, and as like my undergraduate was in history and philosophy, and so I always sort of think about historically situating people and their advice. And for me, I can't, like Tufty is, as you say, he's from an era where the concerns were different concerns, where the audiences were different audiences, and where the dominating forms of information communication were maybe more cartoonish, right? They were, I mean, classically like the diamond price chart, where it's a cartoon lady whose leg is this spike in the prices of diamonds that he was upset about. I believe it was Nigel Holmes who did that.
Mhm.
So to me, it doesn't, and I guess this is the way that I distance myself from these petty arguments. I'm not like all the rest of these people on Twitter. Um, but it just feels like, well, I mean, he's a product of his time, and I don't even mean that in a dismissive way. I just mean that in just these lessons, like you say. And I hadn't thought about it because it's been a while since I've read the books. But you're absolutely right that a lot of it, that very practical aspect of it, of hey, this is going on a newspaper, and this kind of chart isn't going to work well because newspapers can't print this cleanly to make that chart work. That's a very interesting medium is the message kind of uh, angle to it that I hadn't thought about. Who
Yeah,
were
I mean,
you
and
reading?
every
Yeah,
author. Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering who you were reading, because when you were getting started lately, like who do you see as being really useful for people who are, say, early in the career, late in their career? Where do you find a real value?
So, I'm a big Alberto Cairo fan. I'm not too shy about that. I like him as a person, and I like his books. Um, what was so? I like his books so much. I can't remember the title now. Like, beautiful information. What's it called again? Um,
The functional
anyway, yeah,
art, how charts
functional.
lie,
That's
the
what it is. Functional
truthful art.
art
Yeah,
and truthful art. Yeah, those two books were really eye-opening
yeah.
for me. I really improved a lot uh, with that approach. I really appreciated his the way the books are structured, where they outline guidelines and things, but he provides a lot of examples. And as a designer, that's how I learned. In fact, I still got, you probably can't see it on screen, I've got stacks and stacks of communication arts, looking at different brochures and logos and things, all the award-winning stuffs
Yeah.
to better understand what good design was, because that's very elusive for me early in career. And Alberto kind of opened my eyes to what good data viz was, and not just like here's a good data viz and here's another good data viz, but here's a good one, and let's pick it apart and let's talk about why it's good, and let's compare it maybe to an earlier draft that wasn't as good. How did
Yeah.
it get from okay to really awesome? That really was useful for me. So I would recommend those books quite a bit. There's a book um, from the New York Times about their graphic standards that has a lot of just do's and don'ts, just very simple, like do this, do don't for their newsroom. But knowing what those rules are that a newsroom follows, I thought was super interesting.
This is Jane Jung's book, I think, about the Wall
Yes,
Street Journal. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Wall Street Journal Guide to Information Graphics. Donna Wong. I'm sorry, I got this. I got
Donna Wong, that's the
Donna
one. Yes, thank
and
you.
Jane mixed up.
I
Um, it is. I think what I agree with you about Alberto Cairo. I think the reason why Alberto has such reach and such efficacy is that he um, has a foot in academia and he has a foot in journalism. And to me, you really need the sort of practical and the academic. I get very nervous about people who want to be purely practical when it comes to data visualization, because fundamentally, data visualization is a really geeky, really intellectual, really, like it is a very higher order thing to do. And so there are aspects to information theory and very sort of scholarly and academic aspects to it that if you focus entirely on that are going to keep you from doing good work. But if you ignore and you think that it's simply this kind of practical, what's the fastest, most performant way to present information on screen, I think that you can't achieve that higher level of success in data visualization.
I agree with that. I think that's mostly true. I'm going to push back a little bit on it though, because I do think practitioners over time with experience gain an intuition that can be very elusive because it can't quite be quantified or captured or measured, or at least not very easily, right? What might take an academic, 10 years to prove might be something
Yeah,
that, any designer worth their salt can intuit within, a few months of experience. And so I think balance is what you want there, right?
I think
Look
you're right.
to
Yeah.
academia when you're stumped or you really are looking for the solution to a gnarly problem, um, but don't uh, allow yourself to do things that academia hasn't yet proven, I guess.
I think so. I think so. I think it's good advice, and I want to switch gears a little bit and focus on uh, some of the viz that you've created in the past. You had talked about your love of board games, and I think one of the examples that you wanted to talk through was the data visualization of board games.
Yeah, yeah. Board games are, like I said, a hobby of mine, and so naturally, I merged two of my interests, board games and data visualization, and created visualizations of board games. So this is something I published on Tableau Public a couple of years back, um, and uh, yeah, I'll walk through a couple pieces of it. But this is a visualization using data from Board Game Geek. So if you're into board games, you're probably familiar with the website, but it's a great forum and collection of board games where people can discuss board games and rate them and so on. So it's a wealth of information. And so using some my very primitive Python skills, I scraped some data off that website with some help of a coworker and put together some visualizations of board games. And at the time, I was a young father of some kids, and I'm itching to introduce my kids to board games. So I was trying to find board games that were good for kids. So one of the visuals or one of the controls I put into my visuals were the ability to filter based on age range. So you could focus on games that were more geared toward kids. The data was really, really messy, so my first attempts were not great. They got a little better over time. This particular visualization is showing, um, let's see, the rating of a board game. So the higher it
Sure.
is on this chart, the higher regarded it is among board game geek users, which is an important distinction here. It's such a large data set, you might trick yourself into thinking that it's representative of everyone, but it's really not.
Hmm.
It's representative of the people most interested in the hobby, which is why
Right,
you'll
right, right.
see like Monopoly like get dragged
Monopoly
down
at the
to the
bottom,
bottom.
right? Yeah, of course.
Yeah, in fact, I think it's that far right blue dot. The size of the circles is how popular the game is. And then this one is looking at playtime, which is a big factor when you're playing with kids. So the games on the left side of this chart are playable in a reasonable amount of time within the attention
Sure,
span,
sure,
of a
right.
5 or 4 year old, where the charts on the right are not.
And it's like it's some kind of log scale for the playtime, isn't it?
Right, right. I found that if it wasn't a log scale, board games really clumped up into a particular range. But I really wanted, like, again, when it comes to attention spans, you're kind of dealing with a log scale. You've got 5 minutes, you've got 10 minutes, and then you're
Right.
quickly
No,
up to
I
an
mean that's
hour.
it's really interesting. And what I love about it is what you were talking about earlier. The same thing we've heard about the TI-83. I think keeps showing up in these interviews, which is that you visualize the math, right? You see the math, and then suddenly it becomes actually very practical. This very esoteric concept. Like there's this argument all the time of whether the public can read a log scale. Uh, when you see it, as long as you make sure to look at what the numbers are, you sort of get it. Like just you can, at least for me, my mind sees that the distribution is skewed, and I understand that this is the way to make it readable.
Exactly. Yep.
So you've double encoded the color. Is the color another channel, or it's the color just also encodes the rating?
It's just double encoding.
Okay.
It's useful in the
I
other
mean, I
views
don't
as
mean to say
well.
just. It sounds like I'm denigrating
No,
it.
no,
It's beautiful.
no.
This
It,
information is beautiful of Word.
exactly. Yeah, no, it's aesthetics played a role. I'm not gonna lie. I
Yep.
liked the way it looked. Um, I am a little. I cringe a little bit about my use of diverging colors here because I don't think I probably should have used a diverging color scheme here, but it is what it is. You could argue that that the middle is just an average rating, and so that's why I use diverging. But
I
it's
think it
just
makes
it's
sense.
a double encoding, and it makes it look better. And as you change the view, I keep that color encoding. This is something I like to do in a lot of my work. Is once I choose an encoding, I keep that encoding as long as I can, as long as it makes sense, so that as I change like the representation, the orientation, the position of things, or I guess a better way to put that is I can change one encoding, but I need to leave all the others in place so I don't lose people. I can only change a few things at a time. So in this piece, I kept color consistent throughout the different visualizations so that you always had your bearing in color, and then you could look at the axes to see what else other relationships were being explored.
Right. And so this is a now see, I know Catan and I know Monopoly, but not being a board game guy, I'm assuming the Pandemic Legacy is a sequel to that. Wasn't there a popular board game called Pandemic?
Yeah, if you want to switch over to the interactive version, I can walk through a couple things here. My
Sure.
It's not quite ideal, but yeah, I use tooltips a lot because this is a
Hmm.
really interesting scatter plot, but it's hard to get much value out of it unless you know what the dots are. And so
Right.
by hovering over them, you can hover over them, see the name of the game, the rating. I put in, how many people can play, how many people owned it in my database when it was published, all the relevant information I can. And I have another version of this that has some images, but it was broken. um, yeah, Pandemic was the one I highlighted in that screenshot. It's a fun game and it does have a legacy version. So every time you play, you get to put stickers on the board and tear up cards and add new cards. And the game is done playing after 12 sessions or so, but it's unrecognizable from session 1 to 12. It's a really kind of interesting trend in board games in the last 5, 6 years to do a legacy version of your game.
Uh-huh. And are there other views in this? Because it looked like the pandemic view that we had the screenshot on was showing a different. Yeah,
Yes. So let's go to
these are individual ratings,
another.
or they are.
Well, so each dot is a board game, and it's
Mhm.
been. I mean, Pandemic was rated by 30, or well, actually, that's not how many people rate it, but it was owned by 37,000 people. So
Yeah.
you've got some nice counts here. This was looking at the year published, like so you could see
Okay.
that board games really took off in 1994 with Catan was the breakout hit that kind of
Hmm.
brought board
Hmm.
games into the mainstream. But if you zoom out further, like board games go back thousands and thousands of years to,
Oh,
you know, I,
sure.
backgammon and Go. And it's interesting, chess is like fairly modern by
Oh,
this timeline standards. Um, and then, of course, with any database, you have, you know, people didn't put the
right.
published year. So you have
You
poker
have a
dice
null
published in
island everywhere. Yeah.
exactly. So that's always fun to discover. Um, and then this visualization is showing popularity versus rating. So as a proxy for popularity, have number of people who owned it. Again, it's a log
Right. Right.
scale. This is among board game people. So of course, Monopoly is not going to be as popular among board games as even something like Catan or Carcassonne.
Hmm.
And then the way I instruct people to read and use this chart is, above this line is games that are more popular than, or they're better games than people realize, right? So these
Right.
games
Right.
are
Right.
very good, but not very popular. While these games you should be playing less of because they're more people own them and they're less well regarded.
Right. 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 That's
But
beautiful. That's
again,
beautiful.
yeah, so it's kind of fun.
And one of the things when we were talking earlier, one of the things that sort of got you into doing data visualization was this sense of interest and familiarity, comfort with numbers and math and all of that. But then, you've also got this career moment where you could start working more and more on data viz. How does that affect the way that you evaluate candidates when somebody comes in for a job? Do you look for a similar sort of path that you've taken? Do you look for a similar sort of, well, this person's a designer, but I heard them mention that they love their TI-83. I'm going to hire them because I know that that's a signal that they're going to do great data viz.
Yeah, it's a good question. If we go back to my career visualization, I can share right here. I think I can talk through some of that. So we've looked at this for quite a while, and the most relevant part, right, for this conversation is this work part.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
created this to just zoom in on that, and we're just looking at that. And of course, when I hire, and someone mentions they like board games or they, first fell in love with DataViz because they're TI-83, like my heart leaps a little bit and I'm like,
Yeah.
you're my people. But I really do try and guard against those bias because some of the best hires I've ever made are nothing like me. Um,
Hmm.
because Adobe only needs one Allen. We need other people. I really do place a lot of stock in diversity. Now that said, some of the things I do look for in candidates is critical thinking and work ethic. I mean, these are really kind of platitudes that you hear a lot, but they really matter. Um, and for me, in my early career, I mean, I started, as a, in 12, 13 years old with paper routes and mowing lawns. Um, I worked for the park, cleaning up parks in the neighborhood, and in high school as a lifeguard. And what I the reason I bring that up is because it helped me learn how to work, learn
Hmm.
how to show up every day when I wanted to or when I didn't want to
Yeah.
be dependable and to to do the things that needed to be known and not just the things that I wanted to do. And I feel like that has been a big bridge into my professional career, which I've tried to represent in, these yellow and orange colors. Where, in college I had some basic design jobs. I designed a lot of posters and so on. And then finally, when I actually had my first job, working for an agency, I was able to work my tail off. Um,
Hmm.
and you could see here, the amount of time I spent at work and doing work, has
Yeah.
uh, gotten back to a more healthy level, I would say,
Right.
than it was early in my career. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people will characterize this as, paying your due early in your career and then cashing out in your late career. I really don't like that framing. I do think sometimes you have to compensate with time your lack of experience early career. Um, but I think that life work balance is always important, whether you're 20 or 50.
Well, I think there'd have to be a sharper decline for this to be some kind of Mad Men, 10 hours a week and cocktail lunches kind of decline. But yeah, I mean, we see it. I, I think it's just a truism that people, I remember grad school and early in my career really just trying to burn the candle at both ends. And part of what you learn, right, is to be more effective, be more efficient. That things that you
Yep.
were basically brute forcing, you realize, hey, if I try to code this thing for 10 hours straight, it's actually going to be just as good as if I took a break, relax, think about it some more, come back to it with fresh eyes, and work on it later, or pull somebody in or whatever, right? Whereas when you're younger, you think, oh, that's going to make me weak. That's going to I try to pull this person in, they're going to realize I'm a fraud, yada yada.
Yep.
Um, Now, when it comes to the interview process, we hear all the time from early career folks how can they be prepared for an interview? And they often want to say, well, what should my resume look like? Do I need a portfolio? Things like that. And I've often said, yeah, you
Yeah.
need a portfolio, but I don't do much actual hiring for data viz people. So I'm wondering, how do you look at that? What advice could you give them?
Interviews are difficult. It's kind of a horrible format for hiring if you think about it, right? It's like
Yeah,
speed
it's true.
dating a bunch of people and then just picking one to marry. It's not great. You can only learn so much. And so, as the interviewee, I think one of the best things you can do is be genuine, be open, be enthusiastic about sharing who you actually are, because that's the goal of an interview. I want to understand who you are and what you're capable of and what you're interested in, what gets you out of bed. And if you can do that effectively, um, you're going to find a job that fits that, right? And the jobs that you don't get are going to be because that's a mismatch, right? It doesn't align with
Yeah.
what that person's looking for, what that organization's looking for and in need of. So I don't know. That's again a
No,
pretty
I
broad
mean,
statement, but
that's
yeah,
I think it's good advice, and I think it's something, especially in early career, that people just want. They feel like every job they should try to get, not realizing that there's not necessarily a good match between candidate and position. More specifically, though, for the data viz folks, we've gotten to the point where the general advice is have a portfolio, and that general advice comes, can only help so much. Like as a principal designer, what should that portfolio look like? Like how should they structure a data visualization portfolio? What skills do they need to demonstrate? Keeping in mind that I know that there's different jobs with different skill emphases, but like generally speaking, or I guess what I'm trying to say is more than just generally speaking, getting a bit more specific. What kind of advice could you give folks for how to design their data visualization portfolio?
well, I feel like there's two stages that the portfolio matters in the process, right? So first is a portfolio is a really useful way to catch an employer's eye, right? If you have a compelling, interesting portfolio, you're going to get more calls for interviews, right? When you start sending in those applications. And so, I mean, that's just the way it is, right? If you send in an application without a portfolio, you're not giving that person much of a
Yeah,
chance to understand the kind of work that you're capable of. And so you're less likely to get a call back. So it's to get a foot in the door is the first step. And in the interview itself, you're going to be asked to share some of your portfolio pieces. And so I think it's important to, have a couple picked ahead of time that demonstrate the kind of work that you like to do and have a story. Like the story part of it's huge. I've seen the work as an interviewer and I have already made my own value judgments on how good or bad it is. Now I want to know like how it came about. Like, was it your thoughts that went into this? Was this the client heavily art directing what you do? Um, what things did you abandon along the way that didn't make it into the final product? Those stories are really interesting and eye opening for me as I'm interviewing someone to understand how they
absolutely.
work. And so I'm really looking for that aspect of it. And some portfolios actually put that in the portfolio themselves, right? They'll have a process section. I see this more and more. I think it's a good thing, but you should also be able to do it in person
I
or
mean,
in
process.
video call or whatever.
Yeah, process is such an important part of it for any sort of design position, of course, but even for to a certain degree for engineering positions, so you don't see it emphasized as much. I mean, I guess in technical interviews, the sort of classic high pressure tech interview that they're trying to see your process. But that design portfolio process is very much, I can echo that, because when I see that, when I see, oh, these are the directions I went in, but we pruned these, it allows you to say, oh, okay, so that means that it shows it shows the breadth and it shows the sense of maturity, because you can sit here and say, oh, I actually didn't like where you ended up, but I understand you were under certain constraints. This was a company that wasn't making the decisions maybe our company would be making, but I did like that you went and explored this area over here. So I think that really surfacing that process, you're right, is extremely valuable. The other one I want to ask is for the people doing the interviews. You have this background in data visualization. A lot of folks in leadership don't. How do they hire for a data visualization candidate, whether it's a developer or a designer, but someone where they're evaluating the data visualization strength?
Ah, that's a good question. I think you're hiring for critical thought and things of that nature, which span disciplines, right?
Yeah,
There's nothing particularly magical about the data viz professor when it comes to that. But I think that's especially something to look out for. I don't have any golden answers here. I will say
yeah,
something I've seen that I think um, we should be wary of is hiring often comes at a time when you're already overworked. Like that's why you're hiring, right? You need help, and
yeah.
there's a temptation to take a lot of shortcuts in interviews to not be totally tuned in or to rush through things. And I think if you're hiring, spend time with your candidates. Their life is on the line. Like this is a big deal for them, and so uh, don't split your attention. Give them 100%. Give it your all. Really invest in every call. And even if they're not a good fit, um, find something to something they are good at, some way to build them up, as well as some feedback of things they might want
Mhm.
to consider doing differently if they want to keep applying to jobs of this nature. I think just engaging with people as people is just really important, and we can't allow ourselves to reduce people to just uh, a cog in a machine.
You can't reduce what you're saying is you can't just reduce complex things into simple circles, colored circles on a chart. Is that what you're saying, Alan? I mean, does this feel like you're
Yeah,
subverting the entire data visualization approach? We're trying to distill everything into as few circles as possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's one thing I've learned about data visualization is just how reductive data can be.
That's right.
Um, I mean,
That's right.
we've been looking at timelines and visualizations of board games. Every one of those things has so much more to it uh,
Hmm.
that isn't being shown. And so I think the same is true of any candidate you're interviewing. You're only getting a tiny slice of their life. And so, try and make that slice as rich and useful as possible for both parties.
I think it's a wonderful point, and it's a great place to end this. Alan, thank you so much for joining me. Once again, you can follow Alan on Twitter. Um, he's clearly uh, uh, got great advice, and just I appreciate you showing up for this, Alan. Um, and hopefully, we'll see more of you in the future.
Thanks, Elijah. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
All right, take care, sir.
Bye.